Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar on understanding teacher retention in the United States school system. Here at the George Washington University's Graduate School of Education and Human Development, we are lucky to have faculty who study the many complexities between education from varying angles. Over the next few months, we are excited to bring you a series of webinars looking at the U.S. teacher system from viewpoints that include educators, administrators, policymakers, and psychologists. So today we have Dr. Matthew Shirrell joining us to speak about teacher retention. He's an associate professor of educational leadership and administration. A few areas of his expertise include policy, the social and organizational characteristics of schools and school systems, and learning improvement. So after we hear from Dr. Shirrell, we invite you to please stay for a short question and answer session. As he presents, please feel free to begin typing your questions into the chat box. Dr. Shirrell, thank you for joining us so much today, and please take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Monique, and welcome everybody. It's great to have the chance to talk to you. I'll try to sort of direct my attention as much as I can to the camera there and not to my computer in front of me. So today, as Monique said, the topic of the discussion is understanding teacher retention in U.S. schools. And so I'm going to kind of just give an overview of why teacher retention is something that's important, sort of a little bit about trying to understand different kinds of teacher mobility and the way we can think about those, and then get into some about which teachers are leaving teaching, and what do we know about why, and what are some potential policy solutions that might be promising to help stem teacher retention. So I'll go ahead and get started, and let's see if I can advance the slide. There we go. So, one way to think about teacher retention is to think about it with this sort of leaky bucket metaphor. And I was doing a little bit of reading about this, and it turns out that the leaky bucket is a metaphor that's used in a whole set of fields in terms of customer acquisition, data. There are certain math problems about the leaky bucket. But what we can think about it with teaching, right, is that we're expending all this time and energy and resources into trying to fill up this bucket, sort of recruiting teachers into teaching, but then we're losing some of them as we go, right? And so the question is, or some of the questions are, who is leaving, right? Who are the teachers who are sort of flowing out of those holes? Where are they leaving from? And why are they leaving, right? And so the question about where is particularly important, I think, because, right, if we think about this bucket, we could imagine that these holes are probably not evenly spaced like they are in this photo. We might imagine that there are probably holes concentrated in certain kinds of schools that serve certain kinds of students. And so teacher retention is not as sort of equally distributed across our education system. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. So those are some of the questions. And then another question, set of questions is, well, which of these holes that are in this leaky bucket do we want to try to plug? Do we want to plug all of them? Do we want to try to plug none of them? Are there some that we want to plug and others that we don't, right? Some degree of people leaving any line of work is expected, and may not necessarily be a bad thing, right? You can imagine, well, maybe some people go into teaching and they decide, you know what, this isn't really the right thing for me. I don't enjoy this, whatever reason. And so, there may be some cases where, it's okay to, natural to allow people to leave teaching. And then how can we plug these holes, right? So these are just, I don't want to belabor this metaphor too much, but these are some of the things that we can think about when we're thinking about teacher retention. Well, why should we care about this? Why should we care about teacher retention? Like I said, there's some amount of leaving of any profession that's normal and expected. We want probably people who are, people have worked quite a long time in teaching and they're ready to retire. We want to let those people leave, right? And we perhaps want people who, aren't very good at the job to leave as well, right? At the same time, it's, people leaving allows new people to come in with new ideas. And so that might be a positive too. But there are some real costs to this teacher turnover and attrition, which I'll get to in a second, but really we can think about these as instructional costs, there's organizational costs and financial costs, right? Instructionally, we know from research that schools and school districts where there's a lot of people leaving, students perform worse, they don't learn as much. And part of that can be explained by this idea of organizational costs, right? That in any organization where there's lots of people coming and going all the time, it's very hard to maintain any kind of continuity or cohesion or any kind of a, year to year momentum for things that the organization is trying to work on. And then financially too, right? If people are leaving a lot, we're paying to recruit their replacements. We're paying sort of the costs of hiring, onboarding people, and training their replacements. So these are, there's a lot of research that sort of tries to quantify this and really show what the costs are to schools and school systems, and those costs are really substantial. So when we think about teacher retention and teacher mobility, we have to think about different kinds of mobility, okay? And in the first case, we can kind of think of, well, there's what we would think of as school level turnover, right? So that's where somebody is working as a teacher in one school, and then the next year they decide to go work in a different school, right? We commonly call that turnover, teacher turnover. So that's one level at which we could think about trying to retain people, right? Like trying to retain people in a certain school. Okay, they're leaving to go to another school. But if we think about that, these schools are nested in school districts, then we can also think about a district level turnover, right? That some teachers might be working in one school district and they leave that school district to go work in another one. Then if we think about that these districts are within states, right, we can think about that there could be state level turnover as well. So people leaving teaching in one state, they go work in another state. And then finally, when people use the term attrition from teaching, they are often talking about sort of at the professional level, like people leaving teaching entirely and going to work in another occupation. I guess this would be somebody going to work in farming because there's a barn, but we could think about people leaving teaching to go into like any other line of work. The other thing to remember is that there are people who re-enter, right? So people who leave, they might not leave for good, they might leave for a while and come back. So that's also something we have to keep in mind. The important thing to remember, I think here, what I'm kind of the point I'm trying to make is that it depends on who you're talking to, which level of attrition matters or what's important, right? If you're a school principal, that school level turnover really matters because you're losing your good teachers, for example, to a school down the road. That's what matters. Whether or not they're leaving the district or the state is less important to you, right? You're focused on your own building. Whereas if you're a district level policymaker or a state level policymaker, you may care more about people leaving and trying to retain teachers at those levels. So we have to sort of keep that in mind, as well as who are the people who are moving. Are they really our best teachers or who are they exactly? So these are all these different kinds of mobility are things we want to keep in mind when we're thinking about teacher retention. So what is the extent of the challenge that we have with teacher retention? Well, we have data over a large number of years, and generally it's relatively consistent what the data shows overall. If we take the teachers who are teaching in public schools in the US in a given year, the following year, about 85% of them will still be teaching in the same school. That's the large blue part of this pie chart. About 8% will move to a teaching position at another school, right? It could be, here I'm not differentiating between state or district or anything like that, but they've moved. And then 8% have left teaching altogether. This has generally been pretty consistent, sort of slight trends upward over time, but generally relatively consistent. Of those 8% who we sort of commonly think of being concerned about, like, oh, teaching is losing these people. Well, if we break those people out, 40% of them are retiring. 30% of those people are still in the education field, but they're sort of going into a non-teaching position. They might be going into administration or working in a district or something like that. And then the 30% of those people are just leaving the education field entirely, right? So those are generally the people who we think about kind of being most concerned about losing. Just quickly, I wanted to say something briefly about kind of the history of this and kind of why teaching sort of has this challenge. A lot of the issue of teacher retention and how teaching kind of got to be structured this way, we can trace back to the early 20th century when there was sort of a huge expansion in public education with tremendous amounts of immigration. And it was at this time where sort of teaching really became structured in the way that we are familiar with it today, where relative to a lot of other professions that require relatively high degrees of education and training, the barriers to entry in teaching are relatively low. And there's sort of generally a structure of teaching where turnover is a relatively expected thing and is sort of built into the structure of the profession. And at the same time, at this time in the early 20th century, schools were structured in this sort of egg crate model where there's relatively little interdependence and interaction among teachers, and teachers are kind of working individually in their classrooms, right? So as teaching became structured in this way, it sort of took on the form that we know it now. And the point really here is that turnover was sort of a institutionalized, kind of accepted part of how teaching changed at that time. So now I'm going to go ahead and just talk briefly about what we know about who leaves teaching and why, and then talk a little bit about kind of the last few years and COVID, and then I'll be happy to have questions. So what do we know about who leaves teaching? Well, we know a pretty good amount about the characteristics of the teachers that leave, right? Generally, there's sort of this U shape of teacher attrition, where people are much more likely to leave at the beginning of their career, as we might expect, their first 3 years, and then also when they have a lot of experience, right? So people who are retiring. And that's, as I said, generally, expected and not surprising. We also know that teachers who enter through these alternative pathways into teaching, Teach for America, these kind of accelerated sort of learn on the job kind of programs, are more likely to leave teaching. Teachers hired after the start of the school year are more likely to leave. And then there's kind of an interesting sort of mixed finding here about, you see that teachers who have higher exam scores and who attended higher ranked colleges, they're more likely to leave, and they're the ones who sort of have the higher qualifications. You might think that, you know, perhaps those individuals have more options out there in terms of other employment that they can go to from teaching. But then research also finds that the people who are more ineffective as measured by how well their students do on tests, those people are more likely to leave too. So it's kind of an interesting set of findings. Now, we also know something about the characteristics of the students in the schools that teachers are more likely to leave from. And I'll talk more about this in a minute, but in general, research has very consistently found that in schools that have higher concentrations of low income or low performing students or racial ethnic minority students, teachers are more likely to leave. They're more likely to leave those schools, particularly in favor of other schools. And so I highlighted it in red because I'll come back to that on the next slide and later in terms of sort of what might be explaining that and how we could address that. So why do teachers leave? What do we know about why we have issues with teacher retention in certain settings? Well, you can divide that generally into things that are about the working conditions of the schools where teachers work, and then their compensation. So first, in terms of the working conditions, school leadership is sort of the umbrella that's tremendously important, both in itself and also in terms of how it impacts a lot of these other areas below. So quality of school leadership is tremendously important, and specifically teachers cite this kind of issue of trust and collective responsibility and collaboration, the degree to which the school workplace is a supportive, trusting environment where people sort of help each other improve, and which fits in with this idea of collective decision-making. And also in terms of, again, support, and linking this back to school leadership, teachers cite issues with behavior, safety, disciplinary policies as things that impact their decisions about leaving their schools or even leaving teaching. And then we have the issue of sort of the material, the sort of physical building, the materials that teachers have access to, curricula, books, supplies, and sort of like just the quality of the building itself, which is, that's something that's actually has come up recently in terms of COVID in some surveys of teachers that teachers raising issues of sort of just like the physical environment and not being able to social distance and things like that. So those are all sort of under the umbrella of like the working environments of schools. And then we have compensation, right? Just pay overall, but then also the lack of salary differentiation by different responsibility and the lack of sort of incentives in terms of teachers' compensation. So these are sort of the big buckets of sort of why teachers leave. Now to go back to that point from the previous slide, right? These working conditions are associated with certain student populations, right? So the schools where there are low performing students, where there are relatively more low income students, where there are relatively more racial ethnic minority students, are generally schools that have more challenging working conditions for teachers. Again, not uniformly, right? this is a generalization, I'm talking on average, but on average, those student populations are in schools that have these more challenging conditions for teachers. And in fact, some research that has tried to kind of like separate these two things finds that actually this finding that teachers are leaving schools where there are certain student populations is actually really driven at its core by teachers reacting to the working environments of the schools, not to the students themselves. So I wanted to say something about COVID because I know, there's been a lot said about it. There's been a lot in the news about it, about research, surveys of teachers. And there's been a lot of attention paid to surveys of teachers, that have really pointed out sort of the challenges that teachers have faced during COVID in terms of particularly some of these issues about working conditions. Interestingly, and there's not a ton of information about this yet, but what we do have says that actually teacher retention hasn't drastically changed over this period. And in fact, it seems that teacher retention actually improved, meaning fewer people left teaching during that first year of COVID. I imagine because people were kind of frozen in place and there just wasn't a lot of movement sort of in the labor pool of teachers generally, but that since then teacher retention has not gone up tremendously. It does seem to have sort of increased to some extent slightly, but generally sort of in the same ballpark that it was before COVID. Again, the jury, I think, is still out in the sense that we still don't, there still hasn't been a lot of evidence that's come out about that. So what are some solutions to the challenge of retaining teachers? And particularly, I would say here, the challenge of retaining the best teachers in the schools where we would think that students really need those teachers the most, and in the schools that teachers more often leave and who need the high quality teachers the most. So one is obviously improvements in school leadership. We talked about all those issues about working conditions, and again, leadership is kind of the umbrella that under which those working conditions are determined. So it's tremendously important, and particularly in those schools that serve low-income, racial, ethnic minority students, concentrating on school leadership is a very powerful means of helping teacher retention challenges. Also, one thing is thinking about differentiating pay for teachers, particularly in those positions and in schools and working with students where there has historically been more teacher turnover. Making those kinds of decisions about trying to particularly focus on those places that have the most challenges with teacher retention and the retention of really good teachers would probably be something that makes sense. Also focusing on novices, right? Because really, those first 3 years are really, we know that a lot of people are leaving, right? So it makes sense to sort of concentrate our resources on trying to sort of plug those holes early on that happen. Again, with COVID, this sort of focus on safety and the sort of the basic needs of teachers just to feel safe in the workplace. And also, some people have raised this, that, we may need to, in some sense, change our thinking about teaching along with other careers that people in this day and age may not come into teaching wanting to do it for 30 years. And with the world and people's expectations of their careers changing, we may need to be okay with having people come and teach for a shorter period of time, and focus on retention in the short term. Those are just some potential solutions that have sort of been raised, but obviously there's still a great deal of debate about this, as there is regarding anything related to teaching and education. So I hope this has been informative, interesting to you, and I'm happy to, answer questions as best I can if people have questions. So thank you.
Great, Dr. Shirrell, thank you very much for your informative presentation and talk. We will have a short question and answer session now. So those of you in the audience, please type your questions directly in the chat box. I've received a couple questions already, so I can begin with the first one. Dr. Shirrell, you kind of touched on this already, but is teacher retention really a problem when it comes to professional development?
Is it a problem of professional development? I mean, yes, I think in the global sense that, teaching, when we talk about this issue of working conditions, we're really talking about people wanting to have the opportunity to learn and grow, right, as professionals. And so, I mean, I think about professional development in that sense, in that kind of like bigger picture sense, that just like anybody, teachers want to come into their workplace and feel like they're going to learn and grow and get better at what they do over time, however long they want to be in teaching. So yeah, I think that creating a workplace where that kind of professional development can happen is tremendously important. I think in education, sometimes professional development is taken to just mean, okay, we need to do some workshops and, people can sit down and listen to somebody talk. But I think the sort of more holistic view of like professional development being central to keeping people, I think that's very true.
Great, thank you. So our next question, is there data on private school teacher retention as well?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Not much. I mean, it's an interesting question, sort of comparing public and private schools. I think, again, I mean, not to be sort of a, just playing the same note over and over here, but, it is interesting in terms of this issue of salary versus working environments, that teacher salaries are lower in private schools generally. I mean, I think almost uniformly. And yet, some of the research shows that because those private schools are able to sort of have a very cohesive focus, not always, but generally, right, and hire people who are sort of aligned with that focus, right? They're able to sort of create more cohesive, kind of trusting workplaces where everybody's kind of on the same page. And so, in fact, they are able to, hire people at lower salaries actually than public schools. So it doesn't really answer the question, because I can't really think of any data I've seen recently specifically about private school retention. But I guess that would be my sort of general response, that I think that private schools are able to sort of really focus on these things that research on public schools shows us is very important about teacher retention.
Okay, thank you. The next question, does retention affect student learning?
Yes, for sure. It affects it at the individual, like student level, and also at the school level. And then you can sort of, expand upward from there. At the individual student level, research shows that, students, I mean, and this like makes sense to anybody, right, who's been in schools or been a student, which is all of us. When a teacher leaves halfway through the school year, or they get a long-term substitute or things like that, right, that's very disruptive to student learning, and student learning gains, can stall out or decline in those circumstances. But then like at the organizational level, right, again, in a time now where teachers are being asked to do so much more, to teach so much more demanding topics, curricula, it really requires people to kind of work together and learn from one another, and work as teams in schools, right? And all the research shows that schools where people work together in those ways are much higher performing, right? And that teacher troubles with teacher retention, right? People leaving the school all the time just completely undermines that kind of trust and cohesion, and is certainly been shown by research to be associated with worse student performance.
Thank you. So our next question is, can you share some insight, if any, on minority teachers and retention?
No, I thank you for that question. It's an important topic, and one that I've been doing some research on myself. So it's an interesting issue, because generally research has really found that the research I cited before about teachers sort of leaving the schools where there's larger concentrations of racial ethnic minority students, that research actually shows that is not that doesn't happen to the same extent for minority teachers as it does for white teachers. That in fact those teachers are being retained more in those schools than other teachers. And so that's an important a point, but still there's definitely complexities in terms of all the issues that I talked about working environments and collaboration and trust, right? There's a lot of research looking at the composition of a school's faculty, for example. And if you're the only African-American teacher in the school, sort of your experience of that working environment versus schools where there's more of a representation of African-American teachers, for example. So I think that that sort of is another piece that needs to be taken into account when you talk about working conditions and working environments and teacher retention for minority teachers in particular.
Great, thank you. So the last question that I see, what are your thoughts on waiving teaching credentials, for example, licensure or bachelor's degrees, to fill in the gaps in the teacher shortage?
What was the first? I didn't hear that. What about them using what?
Sure. So what are your thoughts on waiving teaching credentials, for example, licensure or bachelor's degrees, to fill in the gaps in the teacher shortage?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a great question because this has always been an issue, right? We've tried at various points to sort of raise standards for entry into teaching and try to sort of professionalize teaching. But it's challenging when you have shortages and you may have to do things like that. I mean, I think, it may be necessary because you have to have somebody in those classrooms. But I think, we kind of need to distinguish the short-term solution from the long-term one, which is that those kinds of vacancies, again, are not equally distributed across schools, right? They're happening in certain schools, in certain places with certain students, and those students, are the ones who end up suffering for it. So I think, in the short run, that may be a necessary measure to take. But again, research shows that those people are probably going to turn over at relatively high rates. And, it doesn't sort of address the more underlying issues of sort of trying to make working environments and leadership, school leadership better across schools that serve all students. And that's really, to me, the sort of long-term way that we're going to stem teacher shortages, particularly for students who really need a stable and high quality teaching force.
Great, thank you. So another question came in, and I'll read that off for you. Is there any correlation between rates of retention and mechanisms for accountability of school administrators? District by district, it can vary so much between school board sizes, stability of principals, etc.
Could you read the question one more time? Sorry, I didn't.
Sure.
I missed
So
the beginning.
is there any correlation between the rates of retention and mechanisms for accountability of school administrators?
Well, certainly, yeah. I mean, there's definitely research like from the NCLB era that shows that, again, teachers were leaving the schools that sort of had more pressure and more sanctions from an accountability system like that. And so, again, you can sort of think about that as sort of from this sort of working environment, working conditions lens, that this was adding another pressure, adding another set of demands, requiring additional resources that perhaps teachers felt weren't available. And so certainly those kinds of pressures, again, which don't fall equally across schools, across student populations, right? Those kinds of pressures sort of had in a lot of cases, the very counterproductive effect of pushing teachers actually away from the schools that the accountability system was trying to get to improve. So it certainly, creates, in some cases, has created a real challenging situation in terms of teacher retention.
Great, thank you. I don't see any further questions in the chat. I'll give everyone a second if there are any last minute questions. But Dr. Shirrell, thank you so much, and also to our audience for your attention on this topic. So thank you for your attention on this critical topic, Dr. Shirrell. If anyone is interested in learning more about the training that our school offers teachers and administrators, please reach out to us in the admissions office for more information about our programs, and just to get more information and to be connected with faculty members and/or current students.